We're getting towards the end of our chapter on the Supreme Will. We'll go a few pages tonight and then carry the rest of it to conclusion the following week, I think. The total surrender, then, of all our actions to a supreme and universal will, an unconditioned and standardless surrender of all works to the government of something eternal within us, which will replace the ordinary working of the ego nature, is the way and end of karma yoga. But what is this divine supreme will, and how can it be recognized by our deluded instruments and our blind, prisoned intelligence? So this total surrender, then, is the self-giving that the Gita refers to as yajna, the conscious offering of the whole being in that circling of energy that begins with our giving, continues into the reception that the divine makes of our offering, charges it with a force, returns it, in a sense, in the descending grace back to the one who gives, so that there is a circuit of energy. In this constant circling of the giving, the receiving, and the bestowal of grace, then the ego is thinned away in the process of this karma yoga that the Gita describes, which Sri Aurobindo has taken up and put into mellifluous English. So this idea is that the more and the more that we give, the less and the less the ego interacts with the gift. It becomes customary nature to simply give, no longer to refer to yourself and to say, I give, but simply it conducts itself through you. And what happens then is that the ego is displaced and the work becomes very smooth. The work becomes powerful. And without the restrictions of the ego being comforted and feeling the need to be blessed, the work simply grows more and more divine. Krishna reveals at the end of the Gita that he is stationed at the heart of all beings as the Purushottama, as the Supreme Person, turning all things as if mounted upon a machine. It's the secret will of this Supreme Divine which is being enacted constantly. Our ego refuses to see it because we think we're the author of our works. So the government is always from inside. We can, in a sense, commune with that when we come to know ourselves for what they truly are, sparks, selves of the eternal light. But when we regard ourselves as being separate and divided, then we truly live in ignorance. We're ignoring the larger part of what is the divine in the world. So, can we have that primary perception from the level of the soul of the divine working in and through us? And then can that perception be shared with all the rest of our being? Because we live in a body which has a life force coursing through it, and which tries to understand the world through the mind. So can those instruments share in that? The whole purpose of karma yoga is to bring everything into union. This supreme divine will, this Ishita, secretly governs all of nature. All the powers of the cosmos are working at the behest of this supreme will, the Isha and his Ishita, the Lord and the Lord's will. He says, ordinarily, we conceive of ourselves as a separate I in the universe that governs a separate body and mental and moral nature, chooses in full liberty its own self-determined actions, and is independent and therefore sole master of its works and responsible. So this is the fiction. This, or you could say this is a mark of division. Yoga connotes union and yoking things together. This idea of being self-determining and apart connotes division. And any physicist can tell you that there is no division in the world. It is one universe. It is a continuum of existence, and all things are interconnected. This is a fundamental fact of nature. The ego may want to divide and separate and think that I am a rock, I am an island, but it isn't so. He goes on. It is not easy for the ordinary mind, the mind that has not thought nor looked deeply into its own constitution and constituents. It is difficult even for minds that have thought, but have no spiritual vision and experience, to imagine how there can be anything else in us truer, deeper, and more powerful than this apparent I and its empire. But the very first step towards self-knowledge, as towards the true knowledge of phenomena, is to get behind the apparent truth of things and find the real but masked, essential and dynamic truth which their appearances cover. So we are to penetrate behind the appearance and find out what is in the penetralia of existence. That's the beginning of wisdom. Not to trust in the appearances. Don't judge a book by its cover. Read the book and find out what's in it. This ego, or I, is not a lasting truth, much less our essential part. It is only a formation of nature, a mental form of thought centralization in the perceiving and discriminating mind, a vital form of the centralization of feeling and sensation in our parts of life, a form of physical conscious reception centralizing substance and function of substance in our bodies. So you see, he's describing how the ego works throughout the system. It's not simply confined to the mind. It also exists in the life energy. It also exists in the sense of existence in the body. And this idea that the ego is not essential, but simply a formation of nature, goes all the way back to the early origin of Sankhya Yoga, what they would call, in modern terminology, I guess, Proto-Sankhya, which goes back nearly 1,000 years before the beginning of the Common Era. So it's really quite old, probably 3,000 years ago, in other words, where Kapila, the great sage, marked this distinction between the real person inside and the outer person, which was all this constructed by nature, the personality and all of its thoughts, feelings, and sensations and experiences. The world as a whole, both world and person, coming from a single origin in nature. Nature called Prakriti, she who creates. So it's not a lasting truth. It's got a spatio-temporal location. It has a point in space that it occupies, this ego, and it has a time factor because it doesn't last eternally. It comes and it goes. It moves here, it moves there, but this ego is always in flux. We have the sense that it's permanent, because we continue to identify with it. But the ego of the child is not the ego of the young person, is not the ego of the aging person. The ego is constantly undergoing change. So this idea from Proto-Sankhya, of course, is at the root of Buddhism, and I think we've touched upon that before. So Kapila was the sage in a certain part of North India. Buddha grew up in that area where Kapila centuries before had lived, and so took up the core of that philosophy and its primary insight into the division between the Purusha and the Prakriti, and reworked it in his own system. Let's continue. All that we internally are is not ego, but consciousness, soul, or spirit. That would be the Purusha in the Sankhya terminology. All that we externally and superficially are and do is not ego, but nature. So we think the ego is not the self, and it's not even the directive part, the volitional part of nature. The ego may think it's authoring events and making decisions, but it's really nature that makes those decisions. An executive cosmic force, Prakriti, shapes us and dictates through our temperament and environment and mentality so shaped, through our individualized formulation of the cosmic energies, our actions and their results. Yes, the little microcosm that we are is fully shaped and formed by the larger universe, the macrocosm. Truly, we do not think, will, or act, but thought occurs in us, will occurs in us, impulse and act occur in us. Our ego sense gathers around itself, refers to itself, all this flow of natural activities. So as it's been expressed elsewhere, we do not think, we are thought. We do not live so much as we are lived by the larger cosmos. It is cosmic force, it is nature that forms the thought, imposes the will, imparts the impulse. Our body, mind, and ego are a wave of that sea of force in action and do not govern it, but by it are governed and directed. So a wave seems to be very large to itself and come into full being and then crash upon the shore, etc. But there are uncountable numbers of waves, and all come from the oceanic being that pushes the wave forward. The sadhaka, in his progress towards truth and self-knowledge, must come to a point where the soul opens its eyes of vision and recognizes this truth of ego and this truth of works. He gives up the idea of a mental, vital, physical I that acts or governs action. He recognizes that Prakriti, force of cosmic nature following her fixed modes, is the one and only worker in him and in all things and creatures. And this is part of the insight that chapter 3 in the Gita offers. But what has fixed the modes of nature? Or who has originated and governs the movements of nature? There is a consciousness or a conscient behind. That is the Lord, Isha, witness, Sakshi, knower, Jnanan, enjoyer, Bhokta, upholder and source of sanction for her works, Anumanta. This consciousness is soul or Purusha. So that's the secret source of selfhood. Prakriti shapes the action in us. Purusha, in her or behind her, witnesses, assents, bears, and upholds it. So he is suggesting here a deep relationship, a hidden oneness between Purusha and Prakriti. In the later Sankhya system, they are ontological truths, but they are unrelated. And that is part of its philosophic problem. How do two unrelated absolutes connect? How could they possibly even see each other, perceive, or work together? But for Sri Aurobindo, there is a deeper ground of being which is connecting, or you might say manifesting, Purusha and Prakriti as poles. But they are not antagonistic and separated. Purusha shapes the action in us. Purusha, in her or behind her, witnesses assents, bears, and upholds it. So, bears and upholds it. So you can imagine the image again of Shiva lying inert, prone on the ground, and the Shakti dancing, in this case Kali, on his chest. He upholds her action. Prakriti forms the thought in our minds. Purusha, in her or behind her, knows the thought and the truth in it. So you see, there's the outer form of the action or the perception, and there's the inner reality of it. Prakriti determines the results of the action. Purusha, in her or behind her, enjoys or suffers the consequence. Prakriti forms mind and body, labors over them, develops them. Purusha upholds the formation and evolution and sanctions each step of her works. Now, this idea about Prakriti determining and forming mind and all of this goes all the way back to the Shakta cults in India, where the Devi, the goddess, brings all into forms. All forms come through her as she represents them through her energy as the earth, Bhu. But secretly, she is always there, abiding as the supreme reality. So there too, the consciousness is not separated from the form-making aspect that the consciousness takes through her energetic poise, through her fundamental posture, holding up the cosmos as matter. Prakriti applies the will force which works in things and men. Purusha sets that will force to work by his vision of that which should be done. This recalls to us the idea of Chit Shakti, the consciousness power of existence, the nature of Sat Chit Ananda. This Purusha is not the surface ego, but a silent self, a source of power, an originator and receiver of knowledge behind the ego. And Sri Aurobindo would eventually write in Savitri, in absolute silence sleeps an absolute power. Phrasing it poetically there. Our mental eye is only a false reflection of this self, this power, this knowledge. This Purusha, or supporting consciousness, is therefore the cause, recipient, and support of all nature's works, but he is not himself the doer. Prakriti, nature force, in front, and Shakti, conscious force, soul force behind her, for these two are the inner and outer faces of the universal mother, account for all that is done in the universe. The universal mother, Prakriti Shakti, is the one and only worker. I don't know that he's used this combination elsewhere in his writing. It's interesting. So again, here, this apparent universe, knowledge and will act separately from the conscious power. In Satchit Ananda, they are one and unified. Here in the apparent triple world, where division seems to be, they work or seem to work separately. Purusha Prakriti, consciousness, force, soul supporting nature, for the two, even in their separation, are one and inseparable, are at once a universal and a transcendent power. So this combination of terms is interesting because, of course, isn't it chapter 2 in book 2 in The Life Divine that begins that long discussion of Brahman, Purusha, and Ishvara? We get something of the echo of that here. At once a universal and transcendent power. And the context of all this is the individual. So he's again talking about these three great principles, the transcendent, the universal, and the individual. One being, but you can see it through these three apertures, if you will. But there is something in the individual too, which is not the mental ego, something that is one in essence with this greater reality. It is a pure reflection or portion of the one Purusha, a portion, Amsha. It is the sole person, or the embodied being, the individual self, Jivatman. It is the self that seems to limit its power and knowledge so as to support an individual play of transcendent and universal nature. So we were speaking before about the Atman, the self of the Supreme Being, of Parabrahman, so to say, which is individuated as the truth of the millions and uncountable billions of aspects of the one self. But it is the truth of that one self expressed through the individuals, which never departs from universality nor from transcendence, which is the core truth of us. It is the self that seems to limit its power and knowledge so as to support an individual play. Seems to, but does not. In deepest reality, the infinitely one is also infinitely multiple. We are not only a reflection or portion of that, but we are that. Our spiritual individuality, unlike our ego, does not preclude our universality and transcendence. So, in truth, we are all at once. That doesn't mean that we can claim to be the transcendent or that we can claim to be the cosmic, but we can claim to be in deep communion with each. We are an expression of the universe, which is itself an expression of the transcendent, yes? But at present, the soul or self in us, intent on individualization in nature, allows itself to be confused with the idea of the ego. It has to get rid of this ignorance. It has to know itself as a reflection or portion or being of the Supreme and Universal Self, and solely a center of its consciousness in the world action. So you can see the beauty of this. You become aware of that, then the cosmic energies born forth from the transcendent flow effortlessly through the awakened soul and achieve the divine goal they are intended to reach. But this Jiva Purusha too is not the doer of works any more than the ego or the supporting consciousness of the witness and knower. Again and always, it is the transcendent and universal Shakti who is the sole doer. Back to this idea of the Mahadevi, the Supreme One, the one whom we adore as the Supreme, the Mother. But behind her is the one Supreme who manifests through her as the dual power, Purusha Prakriti, Ishvara Shakti. The Supreme becomes dynamic as the Shakti and is by her the sole originator and master of works in the universe. Now, I think later he drops this terminology of Jiva Purusha here, but this truth is fundamental. Even in his last cantos of Savitri, you find the shading of the meaning. Who is the Supreme? What does this confer to us? And the subtleties and the grand vision which are accorded to us in those lines is magnificent, and in a sense the final testament that he left us on how he views the order of the cosmos and what does it express. Let's read that note. It's central. Ishvara Shakti is not quite the same as Purusha Prakriti. For Purusha and Prakriti are separate powers, but Ishvara and Shakti contain each other. Now when he says they're separate powers, that's the Sankhya system's interpretation of them. They are ontologically true but separate. Spirit looks at nature but is not nature. Ishvara and Shakti contain each other. So Ishvara has Shakti implicit in its being, and Shakti always acts with the Ishvara present in her. There is no separation. Ishvara is Purusha, who contains Prakriti and rules by the power of the Shakti within him. Shakti is Prakriti ensouled by Purusha and acts by the will of the Ishvara, which is her own will, and whose presence in her movement she carries always with her. The Purusha Prakriti realization is of the first utility to the seeker on the way of works, for it is the separation of the conscient being and the energy and the subjection of the being to the mechanism of the energy that are the efficient cause of our ignorance and imperfection. By this realization, the being can liberate himself from the mechanical action of the nature and become free and arrive at a first spiritual control over the nature. This is echoed in Sri Aurobindo's correspondence. His letters on yoga often suggest to the aspirant that they first get free by the use of this distinction. Step back, look at your nature, look at your thoughts, look at your emotions, look at the sensations in your body and recognize that you are not that. Become free. Solidify that. Live in the conscious spirit, which is Purusha, not identified with this. And then, once you know the distinction, you can come back into the vehicle, mind, life, and body, and assume control over it. You can use the soul force to direct its movements, and that's an initial empowerment that the spiritual freedom brings to governing the nature. There's much more, obviously. Psychic transformation, spiritual transformation. Let's leave aside supramental transformation, but this separation of self from nature is a first great step. Ishvara Shakti stands behind the relation of Purusha Prakriti and its ignorant action and turns it to an evolutionary purpose. The Ishvara Shakti realization can bring participation in a higher dynamism and a divine working and a total unity and harmony of the being in a spiritual nature. Because here we have oneness. Here we have the power to transcend and get to the truths above the level of the dividing mind and bring the unifying power of the Mahashakti down into the vehicle and surcharge not only those elements which are most open to the soul, but all. Bring it and push it into the whole material envelope. Mind, life, body, all filled with this sense of oneness. So this is where we're going to stop tonight. Yeah. And we hope to carry the rest of the chapter to completion next time, unless something dramatic happens. From Savitri tonight, in Book 1, The Book of Beginnings, Canto 4, The Secret Knowledge. I think we're starting on page 58. As the height draws the low ever to climb, as the breadths draw the small to adventure vast, their aloofness drives man to surpass himself. Our passion heaves to wed the eternal's calm, our dwarf-search mind to meet the omniscient's light, our helpless hearts to enshrine the omnipotent's force. Acquiescing in the wisdom that made hell and the harsh utility of death and tears, acquiescing in the gradual steps of time, careless they seem of the grief that stings the world's heart, careless of the pain that rends its body and life. Above joy and sorrow is that grandeur's walk. They have no portion in the good that dies, mute, pure, they share not in the evil done. Else might their strength be marred and could not save. Alive to the truth that dwells in God's extremes, awake to a motion of all-seeing force, the slow outcome of the long ambiguous years and the unexpected good from woeful deeds, the immortal sees not as we vainly see. He looks on hidden aspects and screened powers. He knows the law and natural line of things. Undriven by a brief life's will to act, unharassed by the spur of pity and fear, he makes no haste to untie the cosmic knot, or the world's torn, jarring heart to reconcile. In time, he waits for the Eternal's hour. Yet a spiritual secret aid is there. While a tardy evolution's coils wind on, and nature hews her way through adamant, a divine intervention thrones above. Alive in a dead rotating universe, We whirl not here upon a casual globe, abandoned to a task beyond our force. Even through the tangled anarchy called fate, and through the bitterness of death and fall, an outstretched hand is felt upon our lives. It is near us in unnumbered bodies and births. In its unslackening grasp, it keeps for us safe the one inevitable supreme result no will can take away and no doom change. The crown of conscious immortality, the Godhead promised to our struggling souls when first man's heart dared death and suffered life. One who has shaped this world is ever its Lord. Our errors are his steps upon the way. He works through the fierce vicissitudes of our lives. He works through the hard breath of battle and toil. He works through our sins and sorrows and our tears. His knowledge overrules our nescience. Whatever the appearance we must bear, whatever our strong ills and present fate, when nothing we can see but drift and bail, a mighty guidance leads us still through all. After we have served this great divided world, God's bliss and oneness are our inborn right. A date is fixed in the calendar of the unknown, an anniversary of the birth sublime. Our soul shall justify its checkered walk. All will come near that now is naught or far. These calm and distant mights shall act at last, immovably ready for their destined task. The ever-wise, compassionate brilliances await the sound of the Incarnate's voice to leap and bridge the chasms of ignorance and heal the hollow, yearning gulfs of life and fill the abyss that is the universe. Here, meanwhile, at the Spirit's opposite pole, in the mystery of the deeps that God has built for his abode below the thinker's sight, in this compromise of a stark absolute truth with the light that dwells near the dark end of things, in this tragic comedy of divine disguise, this long, far seeking for joy ever near, in the grandiose dream of which the world is made, in this gold dome on a black dragon base, the conscious force that acts in nature's breast, a dark-robed laborer in the cosmic scheme, carrying clay images of unborn gods, executrix of the inevitable idea, hampered, enveloped by the hoops of fate, patient trustee of slow eternal time, absolves from hour to hour her secret charge. All she foresees in masked imperative depths. The dumb intention of the unconscious gulfs answers to a will that sees upon the heights, and the evolving word's first syllable, ponderous, brute-sensed, contains its luminous close, privy to a summit victory's vast descent, and the portent of the soul's immense uprise. Namaste. Jai Ma. Jai Ma.